Hello everyone and welcome to Programming and Access 2013, the Advanced course. My name is Steve Bishop, and in today's video we're going to be talking about DAO versus ADO. Now I get this question quite regularly about which database connection type should I establish. Should I use DAO library or the ADO library? So I hope to go over some of the different points about DAO and ADO in this video and help you make that decision. So first and foremost, let's talk a little bit about DAO. Now, DAO stands for Data Access Objects. It was originally developed and released in 1992, and version 1.0 was released in November of 1992. The final version, 3.6, was released, I believe, in 2010, but don't quote me on that. I don't know exactly for sure. I couldn't really find it out when I was researching it online. But it has been deprecated. It is no longer, you can still use it, but it's not really supported by Microsoft anymore. And that's because it was replaced by ACE DAO, which was released along with Access 2007. And ACE DAO really replaces the old ADO or the old DAO connection objects. So if you recall, Access 2007 came with a lot of new features. And along with that release, they needed to come up with a way to utilize the new 64-bit architecture. So they needed to, come up with a new technology that was not DAO that could utilize that 64-bit architecture, but still kind of keep the old syntax of DAO. And that's where we got ACE DAO. It's the 64-bit version as well as the 32-bit version of DAO that was released with Access. So 2007, 2010, 2013 all utilize ACE DAO primarily. It is the default database access component for Access. So Access utilizes DAO pretty much exclusively. You can do some stuff with ADO in the back end, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But just know that Access is really kind of built to use DAO. Its functionality, its all of the neat little components that's built right into Access is really based around the DAO library. The record set cursor is client side only, which means basically whenever you're running through record sets, that little cursor that determines which row you're on and where you're at within that record set, that's all managed by the client side. So it's not something that you can push off to your SQL server. It's something that you have to do on the local client, or basically where your front end resides, is going to be managing how that record set is managed and where the cursor is. There's no built-in support for stored procedures, and I think this is a pretty major drawback to DAO. Not being able to communicate with your stored procedures and receive data back and manage that data is a pretty big drawback to DAO. And you can still do what's called a pass-through query to your SQL database backend, but and just issue the exec command, and that'll execute a stored procedure for you. But ever since they got rid of ADP in Access, you cannot just work with stored procedures off of the SQL server. You have to, it's basically a one-way communication to execute that stored procedure. Non-pass-through SQL queries must be written in JET-ACE format. So the syntax is strictly basically the Access SQL query. If you're going to be using linked tables, that just basically means that the SQL query language that we've gone over in the basic series is the same query structure that you're going to need, the SQL syntax that you're going to need with your linked tables. So the native SQL language is not used when you're dealing with linked tables. So anything that's non-pass-through, you're just going to have to know you use the JET-ACE syntax. Forms using multiple tables as a record source may not be updatable. And this just kind of means that if you've got left joins, right joins, inner joins, where you're linking different tables and you want to update some of the data, it becomes very complicated about which table you are doing the update on, and in some cases you're completely locked out of that capability. So just be sure to know that if you're going to be using joins in your queries, you may not have the capability of doing an update on that query. You can have a master-child relationship between forms and subforms. And this is really a big deal in the Access world. It's really kind of one of the main features of Access, being able to have a form and a subform within that form, and your communication is seamless between the main form and the subform. So if I click on an item, I can filter my subform based upon whatever the item was that I picked in my main form. And this child-master relationship is a key component to Access and really makes some functionality, some really neat functionality in Access. The built-in functionality within Access is really built around the DAO. The DAO library is really what Access is all about. So everything that you see when you're dealing with record sets, row sources, that sort of thing, is really built on the DAO record sets. So everything that you see designed for Access is really designed for DAO. It does not need a separate connection to the database. So in other words, you don't need to make some sort of special case to make a connection to the database in the background. You can utilize the connection that's established by the JET or ACE engine to the backend database, and you don't need to go through and instantiate and set up a whole bunch of connection strings and such in order to connect to that database if you've already established it. Now, ADO stands for ActiveX Data Objects. And ActiveX Data Objects, I don't know the release date of version 1.0. I think it was also released in the 90s. I believe it was released a little bit later than 92. I think it was sometime in the mid to late 90s when Microsoft was really pushing ActiveX components. The latest version of ActiveX Data Objects is 6.0, and it was released with Vista. I don't know of any newer versions. If somebody wants to correct me on that, feel free to go ahead and post a comment. But that's the latest version I could find any history about. ADO.NET, this is an important thing to know. ADO.NET is not ADO. ADO.NET is part of the .NET framework, and ADO is a set of COM objects. These are two completely different things. However, that being said, there is a lot of similarity in the syntax and in the way that that ADO.NET and ADO are used. So if you are planning on going to the .NET framework, ADO.NET is very similar to what you will learn when you're trying to do ADO in Access. So just be aware of that. You can only use ADO objects if you're running within VBA code. So you can't, like I said before, there's really no native functionality within Access. There's nothing built in with Access 2013 to utilize ADO. So that means that the only time that you're going to be able to use ADO objects is if you instantiate them in VBA code and set up your record sets using VBA and extract your data using VBA, that sort of thing. You're not going to be able to just use the native functionality of Access. The record set cursor can be either client side or server side. So with ADO, you have the option, the flexibility to decide which is it the server that's going to be handling my record sets, or is it going to be handled by the client? So this type of flexibility is really great when you're trying to work in different environments that might have some variety. Maybe you need that record set to run on the server for this because one particular computer that normally runs that procedure is really, really slow. It's an old computer, it's an old system. It really shouldn't be running any record sets on it. Well, you can just go ahead and make it so your ADO object runs the record set on the server and just does the communication back and forth across the network rather than trying to put all that stuff in memory on the client side. So that's some flexibility that's offered with ADO that is not available in DAO, and that can definitely be something you need to consider when you're trying to decide which of these two technologies to implement. Stored procedures can produce updatable record sets. So if I wanted to make if I wanted to run a stored procedure on my SQL server, I can get the record sets back from that stored procedure and work with them within ADO, which is really, really handy. That's something that's If you do a lot of back-end database work like I do at the enterprise level, those stored procedures become a very vital component to the way you develop your databases. And being able to run those stored procedures and work with the record sets is a very valuable thing. And not being able to do that in DAO, like I said earlier, is a pretty big downside. It really is something that I hope Microsoft addresses in DAO, because ADO has definitely got the leg up on it. So if you're going to use ADO, you have to use the SQL query format, or the SQL query syntax of the native database. So if you're running Microsoft SQL Server, you have to write your queries in the T-SQL syntax. Okay, and with MySQL, I forget what they call it in MySQL, but you get the point. You have to utilize the native language of the relational database system that you're using. You cannot use the ACE/Jet engine query format, the query syntax. Now, the similarities between ACE and Jet to those other languages like T-SQL are very similar, to the point where you might even be able to write yourself a SQL query in the designer in Access and just copy and paste that, and send that off to Microsoft SQL Server, and it'll function just fine. However, there's a more likely of a chance that you're going to have to do some sort of editing of that query in order to make it run in that language. So just be aware of that. You will need to use the native language of the SQL Server you're connecting to when you're utilizing ADO. Now, one really nice thing about ADO, especially if you're running in the enterprise, you may be dealing with very large amounts of data. Millions of record sets could be returned in one query. So being able to return those record sets and iterate through them quickly, you'll want to really consider using ADO. It's just much faster at handling that those large sets of data. And that's, again, especially if you're going to be doing it server side, that adds even more speed to it, because you've got a SQL Server that's dedicated to doing SQL Server things and working with the tables locally. That instead of trying to store those things on the client side and then try to iterate through them and then communicate that information back to the server, that can all really slow things down. But the server side, having your cursor run on the server side and running through your record sets quickly on the server side, that can really help increase the speed and response time of your application to the client, so the user experience is much greater. However, the drawback of that is that when you run so many procedures on the server side, you could eventually bog down how fast that server is operating altogether, especially if you have some sort of timed thing, or scheduled tasks or things like that run, and they're all running from hundreds of systems all at once to your SQL Server. Boy, you can really slow down that server in a hurry, and maybe you do want those things to be run client side, just so that the onus is not all on the server. So just be thinking about those things, where the cursor is going to be running and how big the data is, and how large those record sets are that you want to return and iterate through. The better you script your queries to return smaller amounts of data, obviously the better, but sometimes the situations are just unavoidable. Overall, ADO is a bit slower than DAO, so I'm not really sure exactly why this is. It's just kind of a talking point that's been gone over in multiple places that I've looked. ADO does appear to be a little bit slower than DAO, but I think this is fairly negligible. I don't really see a lot of people complaining that an ADO scenario is way slower than DAO and that causes some sort of dramatic problem. But just be aware that it's out there, and apparently DAO is a little bit faster than ADO in most circumstances. The syntax for ADO is a bit more complex. So DAO and ADO have very similar ways of handling record sets and handling data, but the syntax does vary a little bit, and ADO tends to be just a little bit more complex to work with than DAO. DAO is the one that most people learn right away if they're using Access, because obviously built in natively to Access. whereas ADO tends to be a little bit more complex because it kind of introduces a couple of new ideas and different ways to manage your record sets and different ways you have to, different commands and methods that you have to send to your database in order to make things work. So just be aware that it is a little bit more complex to work with ADO, but really this is kind of a negligible thing. It does require a separate connection to the database, so you're not able to utilize the local connection string, the local connection that Access has to the backend. You do need to instantiate a brand new connection to the database in order to work with the ADO objects. So one of the things I really like to do with ADO, if I'm going to work with it, is to set up a global variable that is my database, and set it up, as part of the global module to create a DB object that is the connection to that is an ADO connection to the database. And then since it's global, it makes things so much easier. I don't have to worry about establishing a connection string every single time I want to do a record set. So just one way you can kind of help set up a connection to the database and not make it so difficult. There is no built-in functionality within Access for ADO, which really kind of sucks. I wish that there was. Again, ADP has some of that functionality, but since Access 2013 has dropped ADP, you don't get that sort of thing. So the lack of functionality, the lack of native Access functionality to work with ADO kind of makes your job a little bit more complicated if you want to use ADO. Again, everything has to be done in VBA code, so there's no special interfaces and designer that you can work with to work with ADO. That's all based around the DAO. So it's just one pretty big drawback, I think, of ADO, unfortunately. And of course, there's no master-child capabilities with forms, and that's one of those things that I'm talking about, built-in functionality with Access. The inability to just link your master-child subforms and forms together, that functionality is really, really nice within Access. Not being able to utilize it with ADO really kind of sucks. But you can write VBA code to manage that for you. It just makes things, a whole lot more complicated when you've got to write this whole VBA string, and have to work with errors and all that sort of stuff that might come out if you don't code it properly. So it can definitely make things a little bit more difficult, but it is doable in VBA, where you can, set up some sort of link between the master and child subforms. And last but not least, I wanted to mention that ADO.NET is not supported in Access at this time. So if you were thinking about, trying to, could I get ADO.NET to work within Access? No, unfortunately not. At least not at this time. I do kind of hope that maybe at some point in the future, Microsoft does bring in the capabilities of supporting .NET Framework in its entirety. That would be really cool. If you could start to use .NET Framework objects in Access, that would be I think that would be amazing. But I guess their mentality is, if you're going to use the .NET Framework objects, why not just build a regular C# application or VB.NET application? Why would you use Access? Well, I personally think that Access is a fantastic IDE and makes things very simple to work with databases and all that great stuff. So I'd love to see them bring ADO.NET, but I doubt that that's going to be anything coming anytime soon. So, which MDAC to use? Which database connection type should you utilize in your own system? Well, if you're going to use DAO, you're going to, if you want to use linked tables, then you would want to use DAO, because linked tables work only in the DAO architecture. So if you got those linked tables and you prefer that method of connecting to your backend database, DAO is your way to go, and that's something that you should probably go ahead and stick with. You should also use DAO if you really prefer the ACE-JET SQL syntax, and you really like that neat designer within Access to build your queries. You should probably go ahead and stick with DAO. But I will say with that, you can use the designer to build a SQL query, and then try to use that query in ADO, but just kind of fix it up a little bit. I've done that several times where I want to use the native query language, but it's just easy to use the designer to at least start out my query. So just something to think about. No plans to use stored procedures on your database. That means if you have a bunch of stored procedures on your database, you will not want to use DAO. But if you don't ever plan on using stored procedures and you just want to strictly do VBA record sets and utilize the queries that are built into SQL or built into Access, and you don't really want to do any of those stored procedure stuff on your SQL backend, then by all means, DAO is right up your alley. Okay, you're really probably never even going to need ADO if that's really your mentality. If you plan on using built-in access functionality extensively, so if you love that parent-child relationship in Forms and you just hate using VBA in order to make that functionality happen, you just want it to work seamlessly within Access, by all means, DAO is where you're going to want to be. Okay. And then, of course, record sets will be a little bit smaller in DAO. You just, if your record sets are not going to be containing a bunch of data, you don't plan on having millions of records returned in any of your queries, then by all means, DAO is perfectly fine to use. So when would you want to use ADO? Well, if you want to utilize the SQL side cursors, if you want your SQL server to handle a good chunk of the processing instead of trying to have the client side used, well, you're going to want to use ADO because that's the only way you can make that happen. If you want to use the functionality of your relational database management system, there's certain syntax within the SQL language of your database management systems. Like T-SQL, for example, has different functions in it that are not accessible if you use DAO. You can only use those functions if you're using the native SQL syntax to that database management system. So you have to use ADO if you're going to run that special functionality. If you need to work with large record sets of data, we're talking about hundreds of thousands to millions worth of records in one query return, you're going to want to utilize ADO so that you can make things run a little bit faster for your users. And then, of course, last but not least, stored procedures are used by your database. If you have those stored procedures sitting out there on your database and you use them a lot, then you're going to want to use ADO because it's just going to be easier for you to execute those stored procedures and pass parameters and that sort of thing. So I personally use a lot of stored procedures to make things run faster. It's a good way to try to manage the speed and efficiency of your databases, to have stored procedures manage a lot of that data organization and calculation. So I'm a very stored procedure intensive coder. So I guess really what this boils down to is both. You can really utilize both ADO and DAO for your projects. You can utilize them in the same project. In fact, I've built several projects where I utilize both the DAO and ADO, and I've even had to instantiate a DAO object in VBA code. So it's not just simply the ease of use that comes with DAO. Sometimes I just find that it's easier to use DAO for certain things. But I guess if I had my choice, I would probably say I prefer the ADO architecture a little bit more, simply because of the flexibility that I have with my databases and being able to call those stored procedures and retrieve, editable record sets and that sort of thing. And I do like utilizing VBA to manage my record sets a lot more than I prefer just leaving that up to Access. I kind of like being able to control and manage those things more directly utilizing the VBA code. So you may find that DAO just suits you more, or you may find ADO suits you more. I would recommend that you really learn both, especially if you plan on going to a .NET framework and you plan on setting up a C# application or an ASP.NET or VB.NET. If you're planning on going that route and learning those other coding structures, you're going to need to learn ADO because that's the only way currently that I know of to establish a connection. Now, there's other things like Entity Framework and Link to SQL. That's another product that's out there, but those both utilize the ADO.NET architecture. So learning ADO is really, really something you should do if you're going to expand your horizons beyond Access. But if you're planning on staying within Access and you don't really see any need to go any further than that, DAO is a perfectly fine architecture. I utilize it, I'd say probably more often than not, because DAO is just so easy and built in with Access that I find myself utilizing DAO far more than I do ADO. So it's really kind of a personal choice, and depending upon the situation and scenario, the what your environment looks like, where you want the majority of your processing power to be. Do you want your SQL Server to be handling everything, or do you want your client-side versions to be handling it? And just as a quick little anecdote, I did run into a scenario where one of our clients had a terminal server that had a bunch of Access databases running on it. I'm talking hundreds of these things that they could be running anywhere from 100 to 200 of these Access databases on one computer, on one terminal server simultaneously. So you can imagine the footprint that caused on the terminal server. Well, the terminal server is not designed to handle large chunks of data as a SQL server. It's not, the Jet/Ace engine is really not designed for large amounts of data all the time to be running efficiently on a server, let alone a terminal server, which has plenty of other functionality it's trying to lend to a person. So clearly, this was not the best case scenario for an Access database to be running as a client-side set of processing. So we went about the process of converting as much of this. We took a couple of databases that were used over and over and over again that were very processor intensive and converted them to the ADO, and we found a dramatic response time increase on the terminal server. It stopped locking up, it stopped freezing, and we stopped hearing about all the problems that people were having with the databases. So that's just kind of an example of where knowing your DAO versus ADO and which route to go and understanding the environment can really, really help improve the user experience. And for quite a while there, we were heroes because we came up with a solution. They were looking at buying another terminal server at like $10,000 to $15,000 for this new server to handle everything, whereas we came in and we basically gave them a solution on the cheap that just fixed the problem, and they didn't have to buy a whole bunch of new equipment. That really saved them a lot of money. So just something to think about, just kind of a nice little anecdote. Again, I really highly recommend you learn both DAO and ADO. And for more information, I highly recommend you visit this website. This is really where I gleaned a lot of this information from. I did do, obviously, other research, but this is just a really great starting point to help you try to determine which route you should go. It's the utteraccess.com website, and they put up some absolutely fantastic stuff on Utter Access. This is obviously one of those things. So again, I hope you guys really enjoyed this video. I hope this helped you make some sort of determination in your own environment, what you're going to do, where you're going to go, which architecture to use. And like I said, use both. Use DAO and ADO in your projects. It's perfectly fine. They can coexist in the same project without a problem. So there you go. I hope you guys enjoyed, and please don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe, and tell your friends.